Hey, everybody, it's Jennifer JJ Manella here, back with you for the CSA Zero Trust Summit this afternoon. And I want to do a quick session with you on zero trust for critical infrastructure and diving a little bit more into securing OT with a modern approach. So earlier today, just a little bit ago, you heard the panel where I talked to Mark, Galena, and Bryson, and we touched on a few of these topics. So now I'm going to dive a little bit more deeply into a few and hopefully give you a little bit of actionable data you can use and take home with you. And remember, as always, the Cloud Security Alliance Zero Trust Working Group has a lot of resources. You'll find them online. There's a link at the end of this presentation for you as well. So the first thing I want to talk through is a little bit about the history and the threats and trends that are impacting critical infrastructure sectors and why and how that's happening and what we're doing to address it. So certainly, I think we all know that critical infrastructure providers, whether it's utilities, healthcare, education, even venues and special events, impacts all of us on a daily basis. So it's not just a topic reserved for a subset of the community. It really does impact all of us. And definitely in the critical infrastructure space, we're being more targeted. So these systems, because of their criticality and nature, we have different types of threat actors targeting. And not only do we have different threat actors, but we have different motives from the threat actors. So we started, well, I'll cover it in just a few slides, but you'll see how that's evolved over the years. And then we also have the convergence or combination of IT, our traditional data network systems, as well as OT with operational technology and ICS. Again, those networks driving all of the cyber physical assets or cyber physical systems. You might see those acronyms as well. So whether we planned it or not, digital transformation is here. We have systems that are connected to not just other networks for business purposes, but also to the cloud. So we're taking advantage of AI and additional processing, or we're just needing to connect different business systems that weren't before. And then the attack methods are changing. So as part of digital transformation and as part of just living life through a pandemic, we have different architectures and structures that were put in place. We had remote access that didn't exist before. There are different tool sets that are being used in the past few years, including things like pipe dream. And so this vector is just really changing a lot. So let's look at a few of the attacks we've had on critical infrastructure the past few years. And if you look at this, we've got, of course, the gas pipeline, Colonial. We also have the major attack that happened on Maersk. And if you haven't heard that story, I'd encourage you to go read the long sort of editorial version about what happened. It was very feet on the ground and hands on the keyboard view of that attack. So with Maersk, they were looking at rebuilding 45,000 PCs and thousands of servers, and they were able to do that quickly. But shipping worldwide was brought to a screeching halt. I mean, all of the supply chain all over the world was disrupted. And of course, in Colonial, I don't know where you guys were, but when this happened in 2021-ish, we were in the middle of COVID, at least where I live here in the Southeast US. Our kids, I don't have kids, but the kids had just gone back to school because they had of course, put them in remote learning for a little bit. They went back to school. And I think it wasn't even a week later that the Colonial Pipeline incident happened. And that was a ransomware attack. But the outcome of that was that we didn't have gas, like anywhere. So all of the kids that had just gone back to school got pulled back out of school and put into remote learning again because the school buses couldn't run. So these attacks are very, very disruptive in our communities. It's not just about loss of data like we're used to on the IT side, but now we're talking about loss of critical services and sometimes loss of life when we get into critical infrastructure and especially those cyber physical systems. But what's one thing maybe you're noticing about these specific attacks? Heavy OT presence, a lot of industrial control, but these attacks specifically were initiated and stayed within the IT environment. So one of the takeaways here is that, yes, OT is very, very important, but the IT systems that run the OT operations are just as critical, because if we can't, for example, with the pipeline, bill the pipe and the oil going out, then we have to shut it down because we don't know what's happening. We don't have that visibility. So as we're talking to these next several minutes, I'm going to talk about, the different views and how we can apply zero trust principles in certain ways. And of course, there are challenges in these environments, but let's take a quick trip back through time. Let's rewind and look back at some of those attacks and the evolution I alluded to in that first slide. So in the 2000s, the attacks were primarily opportunistic. This is where we had a little bit of script kiddies, younger folks, people that were just curious about how systems worked and perhaps how they could be broken. Payment cards were a huge target. So we had a lot of attacks just targeting different payment information, bank accounts, and personal information. But hacktivism also popped up during this time. We're hitting the 20-year mark now of anonymous. So we saw slightly different motive when that happened. Moving forward through the 2010s, nation state attacks ramped up. Now, obviously, different countries targeting different other countries is nothing new. That's been happening since the dawn of humanity and man. But the first digital weapon with Stuxnet hit us in 2010. And then you'll see here several other nation state attacks followed in the next several years. And then we get into the 2020s. So in the past 3 years, we've really had a barrage of headline attacks, including the Colonial Pipeline. But if you notice over here on the right, there's also some new and disturbing actions and changes that are happening. So we have attackers that are doing things like targeting our collaboration platforms like Teams and Slack to phish people and inject themselves into systems. And then we also have an explosion of these malware anonymity networks growing, so that basically that's obscuring what these attackers are doing. So it's not attacking the systems that they're on, but it's using those systems to obscure and spread other malware throughout the networks. And then now we're at the time where we have some additional tools that are designed and built specifically to attack critical infrastructure sectors and the ICS systems in those with Pipedream. And Pipedream is significant because there are definitely attacks, and Pipedream is one name for a collection of tool sets in this space. But a lot of the things that we do in critical infrastructure and in OT and cyber physical systems is we segment, we monitor certain things, and certain combinations of this tool set will evade those tools and evade that visibility and those control points. So we don't really know what's going to be happening next. But what we do know is that we have to take a little bit more holistic approach to address OT along with our IT systems. So again, the OT networks, operational technology, have those cyber physical assets. And just to kind of lay a little foundation here, that could be anything from utilities, power generation and distribution, water and wastewater treatment, healthcare systems and biomedical devices, critical manufacturing, and all of the different systems and automation and arms that we have with the robots. So let's kind of look at what the differences between IT and OT are, because one of the things I think we're dealing with right now is organizations and a lot of the legislation around cybersecurity is trying to drive a more centralized approach. So they're trying to get, CISOs and security professionals that have traditionally worked on the IT side to encompass and roll up into them the OT and ICS part of the infrastructures. And that's great, except for a lot of us coming from the IT side don't necessarily have any type of experience or knowledge about what's happening on the OT networks, and vice versa. The professionals that are managing the operational technology systems are not IT people and they're not security people. So there's an opportunity for us to learn from each other and understand what our peers are dealing with and break down some silos. But first, we have to understand what's different between these systems. And there's a lot of differences. I could spend hours just talking about the differences between OT and IT and what translates from a security perspective and what doesn't. But let's just talk about a few examples here. So one of the things kind of looking at the middle here with the goals that I like to point out first and foremost is that we have different goals and different metrics or how we classify or quantify success on IT versus OT. So on the OT side with the cyber physical systems, we value uptime, reliability, and safety. So this is physical safety, not just data safety. But IT usually favors agility and innovation. And so back to this idea that in IT, we're talking about loss of data, but in OT, we're often talking about loss of life or a major impact of the systems that are servicing communities of people. System longevity, as we get into some of the processes and architectures, in IT, probably traditionally we're talking about a 2 to 5 year life cycle. Now, I know that there's a lot of networking and other legacy equipment that's been chugging along for well over 10 years. But in general, we're talking about 2 to 5, and let's say maybe even 10 years for certain types of equipment. But OT systems, a lot of these assets that are driving our power and utilities and water, a lot of these suckers have been around for 50 plus years and they're still going. And so the life cycle expectancy of these systems is very different, which means if we're saying, hey, we need to replace legacy systems or we need to upfit during our next refresh cycle, well, 50 years in the world of security and cybersecurity is not a reasonable refresh cycle for us to make substantial changes. We'll be 10 generations into the next security thing we need to be thinking about at that point. And then processes. So back here on the left, in IT, on the security side, patching is king, right? Patch, patch, patch is our mantra. When we get into OT, though, it's really not patch, patch, patch. In fact, I've got some interesting statistics for you here in a second. But really what we're looking at is like segment, segment, segment. And as you'll see later, we have some opportunity to apply zero trust principles to further bolster that security. But definitely there's a huge difference between IT and OT, and our policies, technical policies, but also our procedural or process policies don't always translate. For example, it might be very common in an IT network to say, well, after, 3, 4, 5 failed logins, we're going to lock a user or a system. The last thing you want to do in a production environment with OT is lock out the one person who can help save whatever process has run amok from the system that they need to access it. So a lot of these processes and a lot of these policies just don't translate. So I said there are some pretty scary statistics here, or maybe just surprising and alarming. Again, in IT, we talk about patching all the time, but in OT, and this is a report from Dragos, but you'll see similar reports from a lot of different agencies and providers in this space, and they're all pretty similar. Usually, in an OT network, patching is appropriate only about 4% of the time. I think the highest number I've seen is somewhere around 8%. But you're talking about a sliver of percentage of all of the actions we should be doing in the OT space. 4% is when we need to remediate with patching. So you'll notice that the bulk of the activities we should be doing over here are mitigate, which means put other controls or monitor. And 9% of the time, the right thing is just to ignore it, which might sound a little bit silly, but you guys know that not every vulnerability is created equally. If it's not accessible for one reason or the other, then it is something that can be ignored, or it's going to be ignored because the information in the vulnerability report that came out from the manufacturer just doesn't have enough information to do anything. There's nothing to be done about it. So monitoring and mitigate again here is not patching, but this is other controls. So this could be segmentation, it could be some automated action. And as you can probably start to imagine, the mitigate and the monitor have a big play when we get into zero trust architecture. So we'll talk about that soon. But first, let me give you a little bit of an eye chart here. So if you're coming from the IT space and you're wondering what we deal with on the OT side of the house, we have something that's a reference architecture that we use. That's the Purdue model. So you might have heard of the Purdue model. At least 2 of you are rolling your eyes because there's certainly a subset of us that feel that the Purdue model is dead and doesn't translate into today's modern architectures. But I'll challenge you with, we think it's better than nothing. And it is a way to start to at least to visualize and create an architecture. And you'll see how this plays into the 5-step roadmap for zero trust here in just a minute. But these are the things that we're looking at. And so we have up here at level 4 of the Purdue, all of the enterprise systems. And that is our sort of crossover interaction between the enterprise IT data network and then everything down here in the OT. So this is kind of the squiggly dividing line. But the reality is, for as much as we should be segmenting here, there's a big squishy center all in here. So you guys can see this. So all in here, we have a lot of crossover between the enterprise networks down into the actual process control on the OT side. And a lot of these machines that you see, things like the data historian, things like these different workstations and HMIs, these are just usually old Windows machines that have not been updated. So it definitely makes for a squishy center when we're talking about, well, before we had zero trust architectures, we talked about sort of deperimeterization and moving controls closer to the assets. And I think this proves more than ever that we definitely need to take that approach. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks for doing that. But let's kind of rewind for a second and talk about, this convergence of OT and IT and that holistic approach, because whether we like it or not, if we go back to this Purdue model for a second, and you're probably looking at it and saying, well, where's the cloud? Well, where's my business system? Well, where's this? Well, where's that? Well, what if I need to plug in my serialization and inventorying for the different pieces we're producing and shipping out? Great questions and very valid. So that's one of the reasons why we think the Purdue model needs to be updated. But certainly we have all of these other things that are driving convergence. So some opportunities to converge here are around, strategy, policy, and incident response. And I'm going to put a very big asterisk, and I'm going to circle incident response, because you're going to see this come up again time and time again when we talk about our OT and our ICS networks. Because an incident response plan for OT will not look the same as IT. And in fact, an IT professional or a service provider or organization who specializes in IT security would not be appropriate to do incident response plans for an OT environment. So this is one of those areas where we need to do a little bit more work. And then also strategy, because this is where we can take our zero trust strategy holistically and figure out what that means in the IT side and then what it means on the OT side, because it will look different, even though we're going to follow the same principles. And then we're getting into, we have a lot of cloud connectivity, yes, even in OT. So cloud and SaaS is something that is here and it's not going away. We have to figure out how to connect securely to it. And we don't really have a lot of good reference architectures for that just yet. Everybody's just kind of doing a little bit of something ad hoc right now. And then we have some opportunity to work around convergence with tools, processes, and people. And I'm going to put a big, huge caveat with this. And we don't mean merge all of your systems together, but definitely you have opportunities for cross-training and education so that we can break down the silo between OT and IT. So now let's look at some of the top attacks and the guidance we've had for OT networks currently today. One of the interesting things, if you look at this sort of breakdown, and this came from SANS, but you look at the breakdown of what were the initial attack vectors. And I've just put the spoiler alert for you here. Most of these line items that you see were due to something being accessible from the internet that should not have been. So we could knock out, something like 90% of the vulnerabilities if we just got control over our remote access strategy for these environments. And so how do attackers get into the network? There's really only 5 ways that this has been distilled down to, that have mapped back to the different TTPs here. So exploiting vulnerabilities in public-facing services, public-facing being the big key there. I'm going to skip past number 2. Let's talk about abusing internet-facing authentication mechanisms. Again, internet-facing, we're back in the remote access era here. Phishing for malware execution. So again, if a system is exposed. So if you look back mentally at that Purdue model I showed you, in theory, that enterprise IT network would not have a direct path into the OT network. And certainly we shouldn't, in a perfect world, have unprotected email or anything coming directly into those systems. That should all be happening further up and then segmented. But as you can see from these numbers, that's not what's happening. So here we have a physical access. So this is not remote access, but this would be actual physical access into the space. And then supply chain and third-party attacks over here, which is slightly different, but definitely has a least privilege play here. So with that, then, there's a current list of top 5 controls for securing OT and ICS networks. And let me start in the middle, or the second one, which is building a defensible architecture. And this is key because I'm going to come back around to how this plays into a zero trust architecture. But look at these. So these are the top 5. And this is adapted from a white paper from SANS that was also put out by Robert Lee. So defensible architecture means just building something that you can defend. That also means you have to have visibility so you can monitor it to defend it. I'm going to roll back to the first one and talk about an incident response plan, because you can't build an incident response plan until and unless you know what you have and how they're interconnected and what the dependencies are. Secure remote access, that's the horse we have been beating to death. And then risk management is this last one. But remember that doesn't just mean traditional vulnerability management in the way that we think of scanning systems and then maybe patching them. So all of these, if you think about it, have an opportunity to be resolved, at least in part, if not in whole, by a solid zero trust architecture. So let's talk about zero trust and critical infrastructure in these OT environments. There's a 5-step process that we pull from the InStack report with CISA. So this is something you'll see with many of the Cloud Security Alliance deliverables we're doing in the work group for Zero Trust. These 5 steps translate to all environments, all sizes, SMB, mid-market, enterprise, IT networks, OT networks, you name it. This 5-step process applies. And I do want to call out, these are 5 steps for a roadmap, the step 1, step 2, step 3, which is very different than the pillars, because you've probably heard of the 5 pillars where we have devices and users and applications and data and networks. Those are different. Those really speak to the protect surface and the assets and then the communications between them. This is actually a roadmap for where to start and how to progress through. Now, you might apply this 5-step roadmap to pieces of different pillars or relationships of pillars or groups of pillars. But this is the step 1, step 2, step 3, whereas the pillars are not meant to be ordinal steps like that. So the first one is very straightforward. It's defining the protect surface, which really is just getting a control over your inventory, a quality asset inventory, hopefully something that is not just digital, but also dynamic and accurate. And in an ideal world, we would have something that we can integrate into other systems in a zero trust architecture. So I've certainly worked with utilities customers that I was joking in the panel, we talk about, okay, we don't have a mature CMDB, so our inventory is an Excel spreadsheet. I've actually walked into organizations where their inventory were pieces of paper, index cards with system information written on them, kept in a binder. So, especially in these environments, moving not just to digital, so paper to digital, and then digital to something that is dynamic and hopefully something that is accurate and integrated, that's the big number 1. And everything else really relies on us doing this and doing it well. And I know it's not shiny and sexy and hot and cool, but it is what we have to do. These are just steps. The next step with number 2 is mapping the transaction flow. So once you understand all of the different pieces, parts you have and what they're doing and maybe their criticality, you start to draw the lines, literally, and document what has access to what and what are the dependencies there. Then you get into building the zero trust architecture here in step 3. And this is where you're really going to design and document all of the connectivity of these systems and start to identify where your enforcement points can be. And remember that within zero trust architectures, we would like the enforcement point to be as close to the asset as it can be, with the little understanding in the asterisk that in OT and cyber physical system environments, that's not always as easy as it is on the IT side. Sometimes we can't get all the way there, or we have to put something in front of the asset to accomplish that. And then the fourth one is actually implementing and creating the policies that describe who has and what has access to what and under what conditions. And then number 5 is your normal care and feeding, monitoring and maintaining the network. So if you think back to those different 5 primary controls we were talking about for right now, that's from this year, you can see how if you were to work through this 5-step process, even if you didn't get to the point where you were enforcing these policies at number 4 as granularly as you want to eventually, if you did 1, 2, part of 3, and 5, you would be well on your way to resolving most of the vulnerabilities we have in the systems. But the reality is we still struggle in this area. So step 1 is defining the protect surface, which I told you was just building an asset inventory. But if you look at the numbers, and these are self-reported, only a little over a half of organizations say that they have a formal program for inventorying their OT assets. Then so out of the ones that have a formal program, we start to backslide a little bit here. How many do they think actually have full coverage? So out of the half-ish, only a quarter of those think they have full coverage, and closer to a third think that they have less than half inventory. So if you take nothing else away from this on your zero trust journey, I hope this is a big key point. And certainly, I mentioned there are some roadblocks, hurdles, obstacles to implementing zero trust in OT environments, but there is opportunity for a lot of success here. So wrapping up, following the 5-step roadmap that you saw, those steps, which are not pillars, start with a quality inventory because you can't do anything else until you do that. Once you get your inventory, you can start down your journey for zero trust, but you can also build out an incident response plan that's going to be meaningful. Then you're going to add visibility and monitoring. That's going to be probably a continuous improvement project, not a set it and forget it, as different systems allow you. And as you get different tools into the environment, that will continue to evolve and mature, hopefully. And then designing the defensible architecture. So again, most of these environments, even though we have a lot of longevity in the systems, they get a little long in the tooth. Hopefully we can wrap protections and controls around them that will continue to evolve, even if we can't replace the system, if it's a legacy system. And then you want to get into creating your OT-specific incident response playbook, which is going to be very different than your IT IR playbook, but they should be combined and converge from a policy and an execution standpoint. So what you actually do is going to look different, but they should relate to each other. As you saw with those attacks when we started off this conversation, most of them originated and stayed on the IT side. And then integrate and automate as systems allow. So as you get more tooling, as you are able to replace certain systems, just keep going and keep growing your program. And remember that you can visit the Cloud Security Alliance for more information and the Zero Trust resources there. Thanks, everybody.